What did I know and when did I know it? Actually, that's a very good opening for my remarks this evening. Can I thank you all for coming, and can I start this 40 minutes or so by saying that I didn't really reckon he was going to win, Brendan.
No, he don't.
Now I tell you. But I did when I went over in the summer to New York, Washington, New York this summer, begin to realize that a very major change was occurring in American politics. President Trump. The words still shock, as does the word Brexit. Still shocks large numbers of people. And they have a surreal feeling about it all still, 4 weeks into the presidency, and a few months after Brexit, and an Alice in Wonderland sense about what is happening in the Western world. Well, can I start off by arguing that I myself was not surprised at the election of Trump, and the reason I wasn't was that I always thought it fanciful that our Western elites could sustain a globalization process without a backlash. A process from which their domestic populations would sooner or later rebel, in my view, in wrong directions, but would sooner or later rebel. The thesis is well known, in my view. I've been writing about it for a long time. Since the fall of communism and the development of the global economy, capital in the Western world has moved to low-cost areas of the world, particularly Asia, and in the Western world we've seen low wages, pressure on household budgets, and a generation of lost opportunity and hope. A whole generation of folks who cannot get on the housing ladder, same in the States as in Britain, find themselves with low wages, temporary jobs, massive insecurity, and on top of which we've seen, following the global financial crisis, an austerity program in much of the Western world that has made it worse, and then the big issue of migration, which I consider to be the sort of second wave of globalization. So this has affected parts of the Western world, not all parts. It's affected large parts of the Midwest in the United States. It's affected lots of southern Europe. It's affected the north of England, particularly. And so these things account for both Trump and Brexit. And so in my view, my analysis is that the globalization process has caused this imbalance in the societies of the Western world, which is now producing a backlash. The best way to explain, in my view, this imbalance or unsustainability of globalization, which I suppose you could argue in its extreme form has been going on since about 1990, just at the end of the Cold War and so on, is to look at global imbalances. Now, here are the global imbalances. You see this is the US there in red, Japan in purple, and I think China in blue or whatever it is there. But you can see the Asian surpluses, and you can see the Western, particularly the American and the British deficits. A global imbalance that was not being rectified, but in fact was getting worse. That's up to 2008, that one. And then here we are, since 2008, global imbalances continuing at a fairly high level and an unsustainable level. So the social effects of globalization in particular parts of the Western world, and as far as Trump is concerned in the Midwest particularly, was what caused this essentially insurrection and rebellion against the system which has been going on. And the answer to it, surprisingly to many people that it was so powerful, the answer to it in America, and I'm coming to Europe at the end of this discussion, the answer to it was America First, the policy of America First. America First, which is the doctrine now that Trump and his group are developing, America First is essentially American nationalism. It has a long history, American nationalism, a long history. You can detect it right at the beginning of the Republic, with George Washington and the Founding Fathers warning Americans against entangling alliances. Look after America first, please. You can see it more recently in the 1930s with Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement, which was basically a movement to keep America out of the war. A right-wing isolationist America First policy. You can see it, by the way, because it's nothing new, you can see it in the campaign of Ross Perot, 1992, an independent candidate for the presidency of the United States, coming from nowhere, a business background like Donald Trump, gets 20%, almost 20% of the vote in the 1992 election on a specifically America First platform. His main argument in that election was against NAFTA, in favor of border taxes, and he made the famous remark in his television interviews that if NAFTA is introduced, North Atlantic Free Trade Association, you will hear a great sucking sound of jobs going out from North America to Mexico. That was his campaign. And he won 20% in 1992. You had echoes of America First in the Pat Buchanan presidency quest, 1996 and 2000. So this has always been there. But it's been a minority sport in the post-war period. Because what the post-war period has basically seen is the establishment by the American elites at the end of 1945 of a very non-nationalist agenda, the agenda being to set up an international system run by the United States, which would police the world. In that international system, what was it? It was the United Nations originally, it was the IMF, it was the World Bank, it was NATO. International system, many of its critics called it an empire. This was the American empire, or otherwise known to other people who supported it as an international system for peace and security, which the Americans set up, in my view, very rightly, and on the whole, a very good thing indeed. But the idea, here's the key point, the idea of this international system, as seen from Washington, was it was genuinely an international system. Americans don't like thinking they have an empire, they don't like that word, but it was an international system. And what you did in an international system was you took losses for the system. The Americans took losses in order to keep the system going. What was the system? The system was the Western world. Very good example of the system as operated from Washington in the post-war period is, of course, NATO. And the idea was they allowed the Europeans to spend less money on defense. Every time I went to Washington, I was harangued for 20 years by congressmen saying, when are you guys going to pay your full whack in NATO? They kept it quiet because they wanted to run the system. And another good example was the American presence in the Middle East for oil. Military presence in the Middle East for oil. That's all they're in the Middle East for. Why? To keep the Western economic system going. The Japanese utterly dependent on oil imports from the Middle East. Europe dependent on oil imports from the Middle East in the post-war world, and the Americans kept the system going, an international system. But all the time, there was opposition to this growing in the United States, which argued that a more nationalist policy would be preferable. And so now we have America First, Donald Trump, and he's talking about nothing else than bilateral deals. The end of multilateralism, doesn't like this is the theory. Whether he'll be able to get it through, we'll see. My own view is he probably will. But end of multilateralism, end of the big international system, end of the empire, and instead an America which engages in bilateral deals with countries, one-to-one, because that way they think if they can deal with countries one-to-one, the Americans could get a better deal. And this, of course, brings into question why this is such an important time in our history. Brings into question the whole question of US membership of all these institutions. And by I say membership, I mean commitment to. They may remain members, but commitment to. World Bank, IMF, United Nations, NATO, which has been called obsolete by the President, or rowed back a little bit by the Defense Secretary last week. Already there's talk, for instance, in Washington of pulling out of the Basel Committee on the banks. These are pulling out of institutions they themselves have set up. So a wholly different international environment. I'm not arguing that America is going to be isolationist. I'm arguing that America is going to act like a great power in future instead of an imperial power. Instead of a power running a system and taking losses to the system, they're going to act like a great power, in towards great power, in their own, as they see it, in their own interest. That's the theory. Now this, America First, is directed initially at Asia. If you remember the election campaign, it was all about China. And I think America First will have its most immediate effect in Asia. And by the way, my own view about this is that there will be increasing tension there for a reason I'm going to come on to in a minute. At its heart is US-China relations. The US-China relations, which are complex and deep, so deep that many people were arguing one country was being produced at one point. Some of the people in the Republican administration argue that heart is US-China relations is a Chinoosa emerging, in which there's a sort of a relationship between the two, which is tighter and more integrated. Now Ferguson has called it Americhai. I called it Chinoosa. Chinese expert John Pumfret has provided some colour to this intricate relationship that's been built up. 300,000 Chinese students in the United States. Chinese firms invested over 100 billion in the US. Apple Corporation sells more iPhones in China than the US. 150,000 Boeing employees rely on China sales for their jobs. So if Chinoosa, that is the continuing integration of the US and China, continues, the argument in Washington is it'll only end up not only with the devastation of their manufacturing, which is already well away, but the other shoe will drop too, which is the drop of services, that services will increasingly also come to the insurgent country of China, and don't forget they say Chinamen and Chinese women can do banking. They can do insurance. Let the City of London know that fact. So a great gamble is being taken now, if it continues, which is to cut into this US-China relationship by lowering the imports from China. We can all know the problems with this. Lowering imports from China, trying to open the Chinese market, if you can, to American goods, and if that doesn't happen, then a fracturing of the relationship. So I think we're going to see economic conflict, hopefully not military conflict in the South China Sea, and I think the reason Trump has got to do this in his own mind and the people around him is that he needs to get re-elected, and if he doesn't produce these jobs he's talking about in the Midwest, he won't get re-elected. Part of the strategy too, amongst the strategists in Washington who support him, is to do with a bilateral deal with Russia that they want. In other words, their main objective is to limit now the growth of China, and many of the people in Washington, big battle royal going on about this at the moment, many of the people in the Trump administration want to deal with Putin to wean him off the building of the Russian-Chinese relationship, which in Washington is seen as the most dangerous aspect of present geopolitics. US strategy, nothing new about this. US strategy has traditionally worried about the building of Eurasia. Got the global imbalance, here we are, Eurasia. If you look at the books by Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, he's full of all this. The one thing the Americans don't want is Eurasia to develop, the world island, as Mackinder called it, all the way from China through Kazakhstan, Russia, through to Germany. And by the way, there's a link over there now into Barking in Britain. They haven't quite put that one in there, but I think it ends up in Barking. So what are you seeing being built here with the Russia, very strong integration, increasingly, investments and so on between Russia and China. In fact, Russian strategic thinking, when the Americans turned against the Russians, was that they would do a deal with China, and it's now beginning to take fruition. Eurasia has taken a great leap forward in recent years. In our own institute here, Global Policy Institute, we have a lot of expertise on all of this, what's been happening in Asia with Asian integration, and the relationship between Asia and Europe. Eurasia. And when Zbigniew Brzezinski and Washington argued that if Eurasia ever actually comes about, the Americans will be expelled and they will have to have a bridgehead. Where's the bridgehead? Japan and my dear old country, UK. The bridgehead into Eurasia, which they will try and keep, maybe even Western Europe. So the whole business on Russia, in my view, I mean, the media like all these personal stuff, of course, but the underlying strategic position of the new Trump administration is to detach Russia from this relationship and as a means of limiting the growth of China. Of course, now I want to turn to the main part of what I want to say. The America First policy of Donald Trump has wider implications than Asia, and no more important than, of course, Europe. Now, I've entitled this lecture, A World Without American Leadership. And just think of a world without American leadership as far as Europe is concerned, because we're all used to, if not American leadership, then a very major American presence in Western Europe since 1947, and Harry Truman's decision to re-engage the USA in Europe. Uncle Sam has essentially been the leader of the West, leader of the free world, as they call it. It took extreme form during the Cold War, as the Western continent relied essentially on the US nuclear deterrent. But since the Cold War, surprisingly, I expected when all that was over, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when we didn't need NATO anymore, I thought when that happened, the United States would go home, that Western European countries would not need American support anymore. Surprisingly enough, it didn't. I wrote a pamphlet at that time called The End of NATO that Brendan published, actually. But it didn't happen, and for a whole number of reasons, not least to do with Yugoslavia and the failure of Europe to unite on Yugoslavia. Europe remained a weak, divided continent, essentially, on geopolitical terms at that time, and the Americans were brought back again into the European scene, when the end of the Cold War should have been the beginning of what's happening now, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So America as leader of the West has been a major feature of our politics. The most extreme example, of course, of it has been the acceptance of it has been the UK. I wrote a book once called Sidekick, Britain's attitude to America at the end of the war, as we became the junior partner of the United States, attempted to be. You have to ask yourself, why did Britain go to war in Iraq under Tony Blair? One fundamental reason, and I've searched for many, many reasons. One fundamental reason was you never say no, if you're a British Prime Minister, you never say no to an American president. Now, it so happened that Tony Blair overdid it. The Americans evidently rang him up on the eve of the Iraq War and said, you don't need to send troops, British troops, we just want your political cover. Can you support us politically? Tony Blair now said, we'll send troops. So Britain took the view, and has for a long time, that the special relationship with America was utterly central to our geopolitical existence. And Clausen, the Germans said, Germany did too. Fundamentally, German Atlanticism became, I stand corrected on this, but I think I'd argue, German Atlanticism became the primary thought processes and thinking of the German political elite in the post-war period. And as far as security was concerned, not economics, but as far as security was concerned, Washington always came before Paris in security terms. Only France, really, of the major powers in Europe, kept a European perspective based on the Gaullist tradition, still strong across the spectrum in French politics, which sees the NATO alliance as essentially an arm of American foreign policy, or has done. So we can see how shocking the withdrawal of American leadership will be in Western Europe, as though we're now coming off a drug. Now that America may be taking the choice to remove its support from Western Europe as part of the new American nationalism, Europe faces a choice. And this is the main thesis of my presentation. We either finish the process in a world without American leadership, we either finish the process of integration, of European unity, or we fall one by one to European populist nationalism. Quite simple. There's no third choice now. This is what we're faced with as the Americans remove their relationship with us. And by the way, this will not necessarily be done abruptly, but it will be done over time. And I don't see it changing. I argue that on another occasion if you wish. So that's the choice we face. And I hope we'll take, of course, the first one. In my view, populist nationalism, Le Pen, Brexit, all of that kind of stuff, populist nationalism is an utter dead end for Europe. It may for a short time be satisfying, but it does not help the very people who tend to support it. Because individual European nations, which is what the populists want, a return to nationalism and individual European nations are simply not powerful enough to negotiate with the big boys of mobile global capital and the rising great powers. They will become, in a word, balkanized. Thus, one by one, picked off in the race to the bottom with lower and lower living standards. So America First can thus act as a catalyst for European integration and Europe First, my thesis. What is Europe First? Because I think we have to match America First with Europe First. What is Europe First? Well, what it is simply this, that we give up the national egotisms which have dominated us. Difficult in a populist environment, I agree. We give up the national egotisms that have kept us separate, essentially, and see the EU as acting as an autonomous new great power and acting in its own common interest. So we end up, if that can be achieved, and there's forces in Europe which will now achieve that, in my view, coming out of France and Germany, I'll come on to that in a minute, a renewed Franco-German alliance. If that can be achieved, we will have the big question posed to us, one West or two Wests. We've had it before, Rome and Byzantium, two Romes. And I think we may be entering a period where we're going to have two Wests. And why not? We have different interests from the Americans around the world. Not only do we have different interests, I mean, look, for instance, the Middle East. The Middle East is right on our doorstep. It's not on the doorstep of the United States. The United States can be cavalier about the Middle East. We cannot be cavalier about the Middle East. Major difference of interests. Not only different interests, but different ideologies, I would argue. The ideological gap across the Atlantic is not as wide as some think, but in the coming period, it may be set to widen, because I think probably we're going to see social democracy in all its forms, and I include the Christian Democrats in that tradition, social democracy in all its forms could become the ideological bind, the values bind, that brings Europeans together. Now this brings me to the issue of Germany. And German friends, don't mind being lectured by a Brit who's just left the European Union. I voted to remain, by the way. Just talking to Klaus here, President Conrad, and other German colleagues in the room. But my view in all this, is Germany is the pivotal power in this coming issue. And I think Germany, just like Europe has a decision to make, I think Germany has a decision to make, and it's basically whether it will return to the federal tradition of Helmut Kohl. Franco-Germany will see its future as building an integrated, prosperous EU, which does involve, as in the federal US, a transfer union, or it will listen to the siren sounds of the alternative future shorn of the EU in a globalized world with a special deal with Russia. Upon this decision, in my view, taken in Germany, the future of Europe will lie. Now finally, in this new international environment, without American leadership, let me come on to my own dear country, Brexit. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to pull any punches on this. The problem with our referendum debate in 2016 was that both campaigns had no clear vision to put to the people. The Remain campaign, my own campaign, was mainly populated by erstwhile Eurosceptics who had been apologizing for our membership of Europe for 20, 30 years. That was our campaign. How can you have a passionate campaign for Europe if you've been apologizing for it for 20, 30 years? And that was the essential problem of our campaign led by David Cameron. It didn't ring true. The problem with the Leave campaign, which had some very good tunes about democracy and patriotism, is it had no clear vision of where it wanted Britain to land after Brexit. Take off in the aeroplane, sounds very good. We're now about, 10,000 feet? We don't know where we're going to land. The pilot has not told us. And the person who told us to get onto the aeroplane, to leave, doesn't tell us where we're going to end up. And that is what the debate is about at the moment. So a very, very silly debate in 2016. Now, if one accepts the thesis about American withdrawal and the coming of blocs and protectionism, which I believe is going to happen as the new world order, this black Brexit could not have happened for the British at the worst time. It is a dead end. The reason is simple. To walk out on an economic bloc, the world's second largest single market, at the very time when the world is turning to protectionist blocs is, to say the least, worrisome. And to proclaim, as Prime Minister Theresa May does, global Britain in a deglobalizing world, and to proclaim, as she does, a world leader in free trade in a protectionist world, well, is not congruent with reality. Indeed, we are living in Alice in Wonderland national moment. as Ken Clark has pointed out. The wonderland we are now living in envisaged trade deals with the likes of India and Turkey. Many trade deals these days involve freer movement of labour. So both of these countries and both of these deals will be stillborn, as they will ineluctably involve higher migration levels of Turks and Indians into Brexit Britain. Mrs. May wants to limit immigration. A flow not seemingly acceptable to the Brexit government. And a trade deal with Trump's America, which she wants, with the great deal maker, will involve counting your fingers. It will involve, apart from anything else, Big Pharma being ushered right into the middle of our National Health Service. The Americans will not sign any deal, other than one which benefits their large corporations, and so we ought to be aware of that. So that's another Alice in Wonderland issue. The raw fact is that Britain needs to be inside a superpower trade bloc, and only one is on offer. Some Brexiteers recognise the coming protectionist world, but believe that Britain alone, outside the EU, can go protectionist herself. In my book Meltdown, I went through this potential argument, and I tried to argue that only continent-wide economies, like the USA, like Europe or China, can do that. Small countries get rolled over by bomb markets if no one else. And then there is the global go-it-alone threat that threatens the EU with tax haven, Singapore option. In other words, if we come out and we don't get a good deal, we'll lower our taxes and undercut you. This is a recipe, of course, for national poverty and impotence. Does anyone believe for a moment that the continental powers will sit still for this? For every lowering of sterling, there will be a raising of tariff barriers against us. So one of the great, I want to end at this point, one of the great disappointments of the Brexit debate in this country has been the complete misreading of Britain's size and strength in the world. It really is worth stating this again, really worth looking at where Britain stands, really worth thinking that we represent, 4% of GDP and 1% of total global population. Take the long view. I agree with Professor Bernard Alford after an exhaustive study published in the late 1990s that there are few signs that Britain has reversed the conditions of relative economic decline from the time of empire. We've had one success story, one really strong British success story in my view, and that is the City of London and our financial district. And we're about to watch that disappear because of our problem over Brexit, passporting and all the rest. Again, I can develop these cases. So it's been a theme of mine for decades that the British establishment, both the Eurosceptic establishment which ran the Yes campaign and the anti-European establishment which ran the No campaign, the Out campaign, the British establishment have for many years been engaged in a grand delusion about the strength of the country they are running. 60 years or so. We used to be at the end of the Second World War when it was realised that Britain had been very badly defeated economically, and we went to the Americans for a loan and were told, we said, well look, you're going to continue the loan, aren't you, because look at our heroic stand in 1940 when you weren't here. And we were told abruptly, it's all in the books of John Maynard Keynes, what have you done for us lately? No extension of the loan. Then Suez, 1956, when we were humiliated, forced to withdraw by American pressure. We didn't learn the lesson. We didn't learn the lesson, even with France. We were no longer a global imperial power. In the 70s, a few politicians, which I knew quite a few about them, took the view, yes, we had now to enter the European Union, and we had to realise our modest new position as a major but second-line power, join with other Europeans to build a serious continent. And now, even in 2017, we have our Prime Minister going over to New York I'm talking about a special relationship. A special relationship. It's canned. It's sort of something candy they throw out. Americans don't believe in it. We hope for it. Americans don't really believe in it. They're very polite about it. But there is no special relationship in that sense. Britain is a country whose only future we can consider within Europe. So, what's going to happen? Well, I don't want to get into that particularly. That's for another day, the whole tactics and question of the outcome of this. The game is not over. We've just started negotiations now. We will see what happens when it is clear that there's going to be a hard Brexit. I think the Prime Minister already knows that. That's why we had this statement that no deal is better than a bad deal. I believe the British government is seriously thinking, I put this to you, maybe we can have a bet on this, Brendan, again. I think the British government is seriously thinking of walking out of these negotiations. I believe they are going to meet opposition from the continent if Macron's elected, or Fillon, and the German regime basically remains the same with a Merkel or with the new SPD. Basically remains the same approach. We will find a hard Brexit forced on us. We will get nothing in negotiation. And this Brexit government is thinking at that stage of saying, that's it, can't get anything from these people. We're leaving, walking out, unilateral. Why do we bother to negotiate? And then you'll have Rule Britannia, Where Eagles Dare every day on the television, Cliffs of Dover, Johnny Foreigner, wrapping ourselves in the flag. But this is quite serious, because if we walk out on the negotiation, and if we breach treaty obligations, then you do see the economic problems that many of us have been forecasting would actually happen. Mm-hmm. And it's at that point, I think, that we have to face the decision we haven't faced already, quite understandably, is did we make a huge mistake in this referendum, and how do we repair it? The policy up to now of repairing it is slowly, let's make as better deal as we can with the Europeans through a soft Brexit, through continued integration. But if we walk out, if our government walks out on the negotiations with a view of having a big Britannia general election, then I think we have to face that fairly and squarely. And that's when I think if the Parliament is still in the position it is, where we have a pro-EU Parliament and an anti-EU government, the Parliament could possibly move in those circumstances. So I just want to throw one other issue quickly into the, yes, I'm keen on this for 10 minutes. One other issue quickly, which I'll be very interested to hear from our American friends. I hope we're going to be linked up with them in a minute. And that is, and maybe from Richard too, as far as Britain's relationship with America is concerned, the alternative vision, so to speak, there must be a question mark in Trump's world about medium-term intelligence and nuclear relationship now. One of the key aspects of the special relationship has been the special intelligence relationship. By the way, we're meeting in the old building of the SIS, I think, yeah? Harry Palmer and all that. It's now been all modernised, but that's where we're meeting. But the old special relationship based on intelligence sharing, again, is an issue, I think, in America First. And I think our nuclear relationship is too, because as you know, we don't have an independent nuclear deterrent unlike the French. Ours has to be serviced in Norfolk, Virginia. So to conclude, the withdrawal of American leadership, in my view, is long overdue. We should have seen this at the end of the Cold War. And as we come off the drug of dependency on the United States, Europe is the most vulnerable part of the world because it is the most reliant upon it. So, again, the choice, integration and unity of Europe, in which Britain somehow got to take part in the future somehow, or a Balkans future. And I wouldn't wish Balkanization on anybody. Thank you very much.